Really excited to talk everything Fintech and obviously Wise. What is something that's unique about that culture there and that would entice a person who's interested in going to Wise?
There's this strong community of designers that actually care about each other and are aligned of what sort of things we want to achieve.
How do you make sure that there is transparency for the users?
Transparency and trust, they're not synonyms. Transparency is needed to the point that the other person actually needs to know all of that. You need to be able to demonstrate value, as you're saying, on a regular basis.
How do you build influence as a designer at Wise? What have you done?
You need to be able to be sold slowly to everybody that's working with you.
How do you see things going in terms of design with AI?
Maybe that's going to change who we are as designers in the future. Maybe it's going to remove us. But then we're going to have to find what the next path.
But are you worried, though, about your job?
Hello,
Oriol. I hope you're good. Thank you so much for joining today. I'm really excited to talk everything Fintech and obviously Wise and product design and any other thing that we end up talking about. Wise has disrupted the financial industry in a big way. So what's the most misunderstood aspect of designing for a company like Wise?
That's a really interesting question. And it kind of touches on an area that I'm working on now at the moment, which is pretty much what's not customer facing. So what kind of operations and things need to happen behind the scenes for a mission and our product to be successful. That basically points out at all these different tasks regarding due diligence or resolving customer issues, etc., that need professional users to use certain tools and processes to help us ensure that our product is of the right quality for our customers. In that space, design has an important role to play because end of the day, we're designing experiences for those people as well. Those are not our clients. They're people that are getting paid to do a certain job. And we need to ensure that we understand their pain points, but also that we design the right experiences for them to be as efficient as we want them to be. And our customers can benefit from that seamless and smooth experience that they so much crave.
Well, I think that's really interesting for people who think of Wise. They obviously think of potentially the consumer-facing experience. And so what would you classify the experiences that you work on? Is it internal tools or what's the best way of kind of labeling it?
I think about them as internal tools, but sometimes we think about internal tools as things that serve employees to do secondary, like not core activities, right? Like, I don't know, to log your days off, you use some tools to do that.
That's what initially, yeah.
But in a way, there's a lot more risk associated to designing something where people is working, let's say, 8 hours a day with those tools to serve a purpose for us and to help us achieve our mission. So those are the kind of tools we're talking about. Think about customer support. They need to use some tools and some data to make decisions on how to help the customer best. Or verification agents, those people need to understand who's trying to join Wise.
That makes sense. No, so like customer support would be, for example, I'm using Wise. I was supposed to I transferred some money and it's not gone through. Whether maybe I disconnected from the Wi-Fi or disconnected my phone or something. So that money hasn't come through and I'm not seeing it where I think I should see it. And so obviously I need to go to someone. Who do I go to? I go to Wise and I go to their customer support. So it's those sort of tools that you work on.
Correct. Yeah. To expand a bit more, so think about the two core aspects of this. One is the communication aspect. So how do customer and professional user or agent communicate together, but also what does the agent need to see to make the right decisions? Are we able to pinpoint what the problem is? Are we not? This is a huge challenge for us. Like, how do we ensure that we know what the problem the customer is facing rather than leaving it all to the agent to decide what is that the user cannot do or what the pain point is?
That makes sense. And so how does Wise empower its design team to shape the company's direction and the whole user experience? And obviously you may want to, you'll focus on internal tools, but you may want to talk about more broadly.
So that's a good one that I'll take first from a company culture perspective. So our vision is to make money without borders. That means that transferring money needs to be easy, convenient, cheap, and so on. This is a very user-centered vision. So that means that everyone in the company has the user at heart when making decisions. The design organization fits from the same principles. So there's an important part that we have in our favor because we can.
Are you able to share some like your design principles, or if not, say no?
No, of course.
Some of them, is it like, simplicity or minimalism or trust, or, or I'm sure they're a bit more interesting than that, but you're able to share some of them?
Yeah. So for example, we reminded about how to use storytelling. Like be good storytelling, good storytellers is something we really care about because it allows us to influence our peers like more efficiently. Or we also encourage to think about how our craft can actually change things in our product teams. So those are reminders of our levers that we can use to ensure our teams deliver the quality we expect from them.
So storytelling's big at Wise. And so could you give an example as designers when you're working with your team, how does that kind of on the day-to-day basis, like how does that actually feed into the actual work on a day-to-day basis?
At least from the area I work in, what's important is to build the shared narratives with our product teams, right? And that involves having not a vision for the whole product, but for our area. That storytelling, that narrative of these are the problems that our customers, or in this case, the agents are facing, and this is how we can aim to solve them, involves creating strong narratives that others can buy in. An important part here as well is that those narratives are not just created solely on the design side, but let's say a product comes up with a strong narrative, but we may see that it's not perfect. It has gaps. We need to say, that's really cool, and we can add all of this to it and make it a bit more user-centered, a bit more robust. Those level of influence is what we talk about. We're not about deciding what needs to be done, but about helping also everybody else that work with us have the same narrative and be aligned on what exactly is that we want to solve and how.
What's something unique about the design culture at Wise? What do you think? For example, saw there's a job at Wise. I'm considering going there. I know they've done a rebrand, maybe, is it 2 years ago now? Was it their rebrand? Right. And it was received quite well, I think, on the likes of LinkedIn and other forums and Reddit. And so what is something that's unique about that culture there and that would entice a person who's interested in going to Wise to go?
So having worked in companies that are more startups or like smaller in-house teams, there's a few things that I see at Wise being done quite well. First of all, there's this strong community of designers that actually care about each other and aligned of what sort of things we want to achieve. That's the first one. But then I think what's also important is that we have enough autonomy to then make our teams shine in the solutions that solve each of their specific problems, right? That idea of transparency that we talk in our principles at Wise, I think it kind of comes down as well to the interactions we have within design, also within other parts of the business. But within design, it means that we're very approachable as a whole. That means it's very easy to collaborate together. We can sort of join dots more easily. We don't have to be very respecting of hierarchies to make decisions. And the other thing is there's a key point of making things happen properly.
But transparency at a company like Wise, being in fintech, is super important. There's the trust aspect. It's obviously making sure that every action as a individual, as a user, I almost said advertiser because I work in advertising. I'm so used to saying as an advertiser. How do I confidently take action? For example, I confirm that I want to go through with a payment, make sure it's the right payment, make sure that payment's going to the right person. So how in your design methods and your processes, how do you make sure that there is transparency for the users?
So I can talk more on what a professional user experience and how I help them understand what's there and how we apply transparency there.
Is it because obviously with internal tools is a different thing. That example I gave is not the same, but if you're doing it for customer support, then it's going to be, say, making sure that the right person gets the right feedback if you're supporting the right person, and more making sure that you tell them that you want to help them solve a problem as customer support, but there's only so much you can say. If they said, why did this not happen? Why did this payment not go through? You probably wouldn't go through literally the logistics tell me about that, how you deal with that.
So I think, first of all, I remember once reading that basically transparency and trust, they're not synonyms, which means that transparency is needed to the point that the other person actually needs to know all of that. From a customer support, that's also part of what they need to do, right? Like, you need to tell a story that is trustworthy. You don't need to overwhelm people with details. Those details are not necessarily what they need to know. What they need to know, for example, is what happened with my money. What they actually want is unblock my money, for example. Understanding when that's going to happen and why it stopped can be actually a short answer. That is where trust is actually built, on predictability, on when that's going to be resolved, and what actually happened, without going into the very details of what the problem was. In some cases, that may be different, because some people may need more details than others. And that's something that our customer support agents need to actually understand from each specific scenario and then deliver the right answers. We obviously have guides out there for our customer support agents to have the same tone of voice and certain processes in mind, so they know what to do at every specific time. At the same time, what we can do from a tooling perspective is ensure that they have a snapshot of what they're trying to understand, with the ability to go deeper in more details to assess, for example, what happened to a transaction, what status is it in, and why is it in that status. Then they can decide whether this is something that needs to be or can be communicated to the customer or not. Maybe another point to mention here is how using patterns consistently also makes, in that case, agents more comfortable with information being hidden. We can be transparent by saying we take all the data we have and then we show it to support agents, and they're able to work out what happened. And that's a way of being transparent with them, and for them to be able to be transparent with our users or our customers. That could work, but it's not very efficient. So what we need to do is basically read or understand, digest, and absorb all this information and convert it into insights. Like, interpret that information and be able to tell something more useful to both our customer support agents as well as our customers.
That makes sense. I wanted to stick with the transparency aspect, but not from a different angle. Pretend, again, I'm someone who's maybe considering going to Wise, and I might go on Glassdoor to see what it's really like. But we know how kind of Glassdoor, can't be fully reliable. And you never really know what it's like to work somewhere until you actually speak to people. So I wanted to have transparency for the people who are listening to this who may be considering going to Wise. And so what is it really like at Wise in terms of, on a daily basis, like working with other people? What are they like? Also, what is, is design got a seat at the table? Is it going to be considered, do you see very senior people who in design who are really shaping the strategy of things and steering the ship? Or is it coming down to maybe some engineers or senior PMs who are doing that? I'd love to give that opportunity for people who maybe are considering that to really get under the bonnet of Wise and working there.
Wise is a strong design leadership, so that's a pro we have. But also, as I mentioned before, because of a vision being user-centered, it means that there's less hidden agendas on different people of the business to accomplish. So basically, we're very transparent on how we speak to each other, how we speak to our customers, and how we behave within the company. Yesterday, for example, we had this big event about, like, we do twice a year, about how is our mission going. And everything we see is customer focused. I know that I repeated this, but it's just this sole idea. It means that it's people focused, and we are very aware of it. So working at Wise is, for me, the first time that I saw a right balance of a big company with kind of like a big sort of chunk of remit to take care of, but also enough speed for us to try and see how things work. To make this a possibility, we need to have transparency at the heart. And I see this happening at Wise. And maybe if you have an extra question on this, I can expand on some aspects. But
yeah, no. So I mean, we can make it even. Would you strongly recommend? Obviously, it depends on what people are looking for, but ultimately, you would strongly recommend someone to maybe go to Wise as a product designer. Like you can have a great experience.
yeah, I'm confident saying yes, and I work there, so my answer can be a bit biased, but definitely, I would recommend going there. It's somewhere I feel comfortable working in, and I feel there's big challenges ahead, big missions ahead that keeps me motivated, and yeah, I enjoy going to the office like a regular basis. So
what's the reason why I wouldn't want to go to Wise?
The way I see it, and I have to be very honest that that's my way of saying things, but you need to be ready to act fast, be comfortable with things changing often. You need to be basically motivated for the overall thing we're trying to achieve. I think that's, for me, like the big thing. If you're in a comfortable place that basically just like keeps working on a problem without expecting big returns, that would be very motivating. But from always perspective, I find it's a very ethical mission that we're after, and it's a great environment to be working in. So that's what I would say.
So, okay. And do you find, how are projects, now the more senior you get, usually, congratulations, you just became a staff product designer.
Thank you. Right. That's correct. Yeah. A few months ago.
Okay. Okay. So not just, but a couple months ago.
But still in the process of transitioning and understanding.
Sure. Okay. So, congratulations. So as you get more senior, the work often gets more ambiguous, and some things are not handed to you on a plate in terms of the work. So you think about, if you're a junior coming in, here's a project. It's usually a really small thing. It's maybe, improve, on this last page of this flow, we're seeing drop off of this funnel. And so we want to increase the conversion. So it might just be come up with ways you might increase the conversions on a specific page. So your scope is really tightly narrowed down, and it might be changing the color of a button or something like that. But when you get to your level, how do things work at Wise? Is there a little bit of competitiveness to kind of fight for scope? Or is it still just kind of handed to you and you just need to run with it? Are you kind of left to your own devices to kind of come up with new directions or new opportunities?
I think that depends on a case-by-case scenario. So I can talk about my own experience. The remedy you're trying to cover, it's, in my case, defined by my position and the people I work with. What's not set up in stone is how do we get there? And who do we collaborate with in order to make this a possibility? So I would say that the big change that I'm seeing, in my perspective, is that your remit starts spreading across different teams and trying to align those teams together, build something. That's the big part that I see as a difference. You're trying to do something quite specific, but in order to make it happen, you cannot act in isolation within your team. You need to actually align with other teams, and even beyond design, have a better alignment with other peers that maybe in product engineering or analytics.
So you're saying the key delta really is more, you're just working across multiple teams and there's more alignment needed, and obviously there's more accountability. Is that effectively how you see the change?
For me, yes, that's what I said. Different people may have different experiences, and there's obviously, on this alignment process, there's a lot of using other people's powers as well to reinforce what you're trying to achieve.
Are you told that you need to work across all the different teams, or you just, here's a problem and you go, oh, actually this touches this team, it touches that team, and then you just have to, so you kind of work it out yourself and then you go ahead?
So I think naturally you see those relationships. You're not told who to work with. In a way, you're basically given a remit based on the team you're working in, the team you're embedded in, but that team needs to sort out everything else that may belong to other different teams. And maybe if something happens, in my case, is that my team is a bit more like a platform team, if we think about it. It's how do we actually bring together all these different tooling solutions into something that is more standard and systemized. We have to collaborate with all these other tooling teams because we need their buy-in in order to be able to produce this platform. We cannot just like go ahead and produce a platform and then say, now you have to use it. Getting adoption means getting people to understand what we're trying to do, seeing what the value of what we're trying to do is, and getting them to be excited about that move and about changing things and buying into a narrative.
Makes sense. And because you're working across teams, does this scenario ever come up where you're working across different teams, you're working on an initiative, but someone else is kind of working on your area? And does that happen? And how often at Wise? And how do you deal with that when you're almost fighting for scope a little bit? And does fighting for scope happen?
So it does happen. It hasn't happened to me yet, to be honest. But what I can see is that there's obviously a lot of different people that is able to cover part of the problem we're trying to solve. And I think a good realization to have and to be able to use is that you just can't solve a problem on your own. The use scope is more about how do you solve a problem. And if you can use others to help you solve the problem, I think that is an important tool to use in your favor as well.
But you don't see, whereas like when you're working across those different teams, though, you don't come across a scenario where you're working on an initiative and you go, well, it kind of overlaps a little bit with this team. And so that team think they should be tackling it, or they are tackling it, or their way of tackling it is better. And therefore, there's a little bit of competition. Does that happen?
It happens in my space. That is less occurring on the design space, but more on the fact that engineering solutions kind of take place. And then we need to see how those engineering solutions actually match our narrative and where we're trying to go.
Do you think that's indicative of the fact that you work on internal tools, so you don't have that as much, so it's a bit more ring-fenced?
I think overall, what I would say is that it's very easy for internal tools spaces to be less mature than customer-facing ones, because there's more user experience goals to be achieved in the customer-facing areas than it is in the internal tooling areas. But that said, and going back to what you were saying on what we do in these cases, I think it's important as well to be able to make compromises and say, look, maybe we have two solutions, but can we stop the team? If we can stop it, then that's great. We can stop them and then try to sell the idea that maybe in a year time, we're going to have something that's going to cover their needs too. Or we can just say, that's cool. They're going to solve the problem first. And what we're going to create is going to be something that in the future is going to be able to replace that. And that's an important aspect to be using as well. Like, we cannot get into this fighting mode, because then it's not that productive. We need to be able to accept certain trade-offs and continue with our goals, which may be a bit higher than just trying to stop or trying to change another team plans.
That sounds good. It sounds like a nice environment then, doesn't it? It sounds very amicable. It sounds like there's a healthy amount of competition, but not so, you're going to be stressed out, basically. I was going to say, with internal tools, and this, I hope this doesn't come across rude, because it's not consumer facing, some companies may think that because it's internal, then the aesthetics and the experience and the effort to push the design might not be as valued. And so, is that the case at Wise? I'm sure it's not. But if it, and how do you deal with that? Because you might come across, it costs X amount to roll out this feature or this experience, but it's internal, so it doesn't matter if it, as long as it works. Does this happen? And how do you deal with that? And how often and so forth?
So that's something I've seen both at Wise and other companies when touching these pieces of software that are not getting us new customers, basically, but not directly at least. It does happen. But it's also the fact that design needs or has its own needs when it comes to internal tools. So we may try to say we have this branding and we want those internal tools to reflect that branding. That's a goal that we definitely at some point want. But that branding needs to be adapted to something that somebody's going to see, again, 8 hours a day. So how we actually shape this in order to, rather than try to sell a concept or represent branding, to be as lightweight as possible, so we don't produce cognitive load, for example, on on the people working on those tools. What I said before as well, that there's a lower level of maturity, it means also that first we need to, for example, have very clear patterns and ways of working with those tools so that agents in this case can work across different teams, different tools, and still use the same ways to solve problems. That's something we're working on a regular basis. And another aspect to all of this is how we bring this maturity up by creating narratives that help our product teams and the people we work with to understand the value of creating top-notch tools for our professional users too. We need though to differentiate how the aesthetics themselves change from a customer-facing product and a professional user-facing product.
I was going to ask about now that the fact that you're a staff product designer, how are you feeling about it?
That's a very generic question. Can you specify a bit more?
Of course. I remember when I became a staff product designer at Meta, super happy, of course, and super excited. And I was like, great. And I was like, okay, I felt like now the bar is obviously higher, which I love as well. I love just pushing and challenging. I want it to be even higher than, obviously be even further than that, be a 7 and so forth. But there is a certain expectation. And so there is obviously a level of pressure associated with that. The higher you go, the expectation and the value you need to provide back to the company is constantly questioned, particularly in an environment where cuts are being made, cutbacks, and you could say, well, this person could, someone who's maybe a lower level, potentially be doing this work and be being paid less. I'm sure that's not the case, but there is a pressure attached to it. And I don't know if you've been thought about that, or if you've not, and I've just kind of you've gone, no, I didn't think about that, and now I'm terrified. But is there anything, any thoughts you have about that, or any feelings?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and it's something I think about often. And you need to be able to demonstrate value, as you're saying, on a regular basis. But one thing that I notice is that the value you're willing to deliver works a bit more on the mid to long term versus the short term. And that's something that, first of all, is my first sort of like months in this. So I'm still sort of like on the beginnings of this journey, right? But I feel like having a lot more of a strategy standpoint and what you're trying to achieve and how becomes way more key with this. So what I think changes big time is the perspective you're trying to approach the problems from, and how long-term you're thinking, and what does that mean for your daily regular work. Whether other people can do our job as staff designers, that's the kind of intrinsic competition that exists between all of us on a regular basis, which often means that, hey, maybe that's going to be the case. But then can I use the opportunity to actually learn from my peers? Like this, I'm not going to be perfect. My peers are going to be better in some aspects, and I'm going to be better in others. How do I actually use their expertise to also become myself a better designer and a better staff designer as well?
What develops, right? So your hard skills as you become more senior, potentially, it depends what kind of axes you want to push. You might be very wanting to really push the craft. You might want to really be pushing leadership. It might be like pushing and supporting people more, like you almost manager type direction. And so your skills may not have the same kind of hockey stick upward improvement, but your soft skills will. And the value is, I think the subject knowledge is something that is really appealing to, say, the likes of Wise, that they would like you to stay because you've got that subject knowledge, and it is very complex, and ramping someone up who's new to get that information is a pain. And so that's where a lot of the value also comes from, doesn't it? It's not just being a designer, it's subject knowledge, no?
That's a fair point. And it also comes, or differs depending on the area you're in. Because, for example, when I started working on tooling for customer support and I moved then to tooling a bit more broadly, understanding what we're trying to get to, understanding what those user needs are and what the business needs are in that area, and what are the kind of patterns and tricks you use to ensure that that's as efficient as you can make it, that's something that takes a while to get on board with, because it's almost a different ecosystem. You're not in the ecosystem of helping the customers, which may have pain points, and then you kind of satisfy those customers and things get resolved. It's a bit more of a psychological game on how you balance pain points the user needs, but also what the company expects from those professional users, meaning efficiency, speed, results.
Makes sense. Can you share an example of a design decision at Wise that was particularly challenging, but ended up being super impactful? If not Wise, then any other examples, but Wise would be good.
So one day I often think of, and I was at Wise before I became staff, but at some point we're at a stage where we're delivering this new piece of software for customer support, and we needed to resolve any issues that came as part of releasing that piece. That became a bit of a firefighting mode for all the team. And what became clear to me from my perspective was that we need to change a bit the narrative of what we're trying to achieve here. Why do we come to work? Do we come to work just, to like every day try to solve problems and then incrementally get to a better state? Or do we want to have a bit more of a high level picture of where we want to go and how we achieve it? And at that point, I started like having conversations with my peers on how can we actually change this? How can we build narratives that point us towards the brighter future in a way? Based on this, I kind of co-created with my product and engineering teams a set of guiding principles for us for tooling, basically, to operate. How do we actually like make things that do not sacrifice the user experience on the professional user side, but also help us achieve our goals? So how do we again balance these two needs to get to a better state? And those principles are still used nowadays to define how do we actually define those, or how do we actually build those tools, and what are the risks associated to building with those tools.
So you were saying those have been impactful, and that was one of the things, and that was very challenging. And so how have you measured that impact? How would you kind of like? It doesn't have to be super literal, but how would you say? Is it just anecdotal?
No. We do have ways to measure this. Like, first, there's a part that's internal, right? Like, it's how much your team actually engage with those concepts. Like, seeing, for example, my team use Slack emojis on those principles to talk about what's failing on the product, or to share that in meetings, like mention those principles and like talk about those subjects as problems we need to solve. That's one aspect which may not be impacting our users. But there's one aspect as well, and that's something I work with research too on.
So you were saying there, so the first one is basically, are people using it? Like, for example, you came up with these values or these principles, and then it was used for a project, and then it could go one or two ways where no one uses them ever again, or people always use them and they always talk about them and always reference them. So that's kind of like almost like a litmus test of knowing whether it's been successful through those channels. Not the most quantitative, but yes, that's definitely something, isn't it? And then, sorry, the second?
So the second is more about how we as a team, and that was led by research mostly, but have surveys to understand how much our tool is trusted by our professional users. And obviously that's just not the principles, but the way we assess that, it's linked to those principles.
How do you decouple the success of, say, your customer support? You work on some products, some features, and the customer support team complete more tickets in H2 versus H1 based on the new experiences you've created. So how do you necessarily tie that to those principles, and how do you know it's not a combination of lots of other factors?
So I don't tie the results, like the metrics on efficiency, of support with those principles. Instead, what we see is how much is an agent able to trust the tools we're building. And from there, like knowing that the trust increases, which we saw increase, then we know we
So
can
you measure
execute more.
trust. Oh, so you did. So you worked on these principles. You've done a before and after. Kind of what is their trust level now? What is their trust level after? You measured that like 1 to 10 or something across lots of different customer support team members, and you saw that increase. So you could tie it back to that. The reason I ask is there's lots of things that people do in work that are fantastic, but you almost need to quantify it to kind of, without it being an almost inefficient use of time. There's lots of things you can do in your work and so on, but unless you can tie it back to some measurable gains, it often, one, could be brushed under the carpet, 2, you won't get the credit for it, or 3, I get it. It will just kind of be there, being used, but not very explicitly. And so that's why I'm asking. I'm like, how can you make sure that this actually has got value and this has been measured and everyone can see that value? And obviously that looks fantastic upon you in terms of the person who's kind of implemented it.
So I would say, maybe that's controversial, but there's foundational pieces that is as important to maybe try to have some quantitative value or metrics to justify it as it is to convince not just your peers, but leadership about the need of it. So if you can pinpoint what the problems are, and the problems are actually on the team level, then that becomes an important piece of work you can actually spend time on. The other part is that the team synergies change, and leadership is able to see that as a result of everything that happened, but those things that are foundational end up being the essence of the team as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. It kind of feeds on to the next question, which is, how do you build influence as a designer at Wise? What have you done? Are there any strategies that you've implemented? Because obviously there is, influence always sounds a bit, I don't know, it has certain connotations, but ultimately, if you are going to get people to align with your directions, your plans, your thoughts, you do need to have a certain amount of influence. And so what have you done? And can you share like any nuggets of that people could use and leverage?
That's a very interesting question, because we often think about influence being very like talking like to a group of people or trying to pitch certain aspects or like a one-off thing, right? But reality is that it happens very slowly by gaining the trust of the people you work with. That means that it's not just that you have to catch up regularly with your peers, which you would do anyway, but it's that those ideas that you actually want to push forward cannot come as a surprise. They need to be able to be sold slowly to everybody that's working with you. When the time comes to maybe execute those ideas and be bolder about them, people tends to be in with this because they've been with you through the journey of making those ideas happen. Let's say, for example, I'm creating a vision for a product because we just don't have one. That I cannot just do that in isolation. I just need to be able to pinpoint to leadership as well as my peers about the need for this and start talking about the topics that need to be covered by this vision. It means doing maybe a workshop that we try to shape us as understanding the big topics or pain points that exist within the area. And then that translates into things that we try to solve in a more tangible manner. But what I would say is 2 points. One is the slow influence of talking to people about your ideas in a regular basis and ensuring that when things actually happen, they are really sold. And the other part is there's a point where you need to visualize things. Conversations kind of go up to a certain way, but there's a point where you need to be able to say, all of these things that we spoke about, here's what I imagine it to be. And also help visualize what other people is talking about, because some people and your organization that may not be designers may talk about ideas, and you need to help them visualize what they're talking about so you can compare on a regular basis, like between two different approaches to solve the same problem.
I like both those points, that bringing people along, getting them in early, that can build a support influence. It's almost you're building relationships, aren't you? And it's like you can't have influence without the relationships. So building the relationships, getting everyone on side and bringing them along on the journey. And then the other thing, which I think is underutilized by designers, and that, I don't want to sound cheesy, but this, the superpower of a designer. But those design pieces, you don't have to wait for someone to push the button at the top, or who's more senior, a PM or whatever, in terms of a piece of work, because there might be documentations, and they might be talking about an idea. It might be a one pager. It might be, a potential, a one pager, or maybe a product brief even. And they might be kind of still trying to get alignment and so on. And so you could, as a designer, do one of two things. You could just wait for them to try and get alignment, so they could let that happen, but that could go on for an eternity. Or you can go, look, I'm going to come in. Let me take what you're trying to communicate and visualize it, and really use that. I'm doing something now at the moment, and I've called it just a design stimulus to reduce the stakes. So instead of saying, here's the design vision, which sounds that could be a bit higher stakes and a bit more open to challenge. But if you call it a stimulus, particularly for projects that are particularly ambiguous, a stimulus might just be that we're just using this to help your discussion and move it along. And so already you're involved, you're steering the ship, and you're giving guidance, and that's helping them move along. It also gives energy to the project. And so I think your 2 points, I completely align with those. Another one, like you can think let's take sport, for example. If you think about, you've got different leaders, you might have, in football, for example, you might have that kind of player who shouts a lot at the other team, who's very vocal. Roy Keane comes to mind when you think about football from Manchester United years ago. Very vocal. Or you can have someone who's a bit, if you think basketball, maybe like Michael Jordan, who didn't shout a lot, wasn't very loud and so on, but just led by just being amazing player and just being really good. So you could take that metaphor, that simile, as a designer, and say, I think the way to influence is, there's no secret to it, just be really good at design. And what does that mean? Design is loads of different things, but it could be the craft, nail your craft, execute, really push it. If you've got an idea there's a piece of work, it might even be something as simple as a deprecation, which can be quite boring. Maybe it's a bit overkill, or maybe it's a small piece of work. You can really push that design through obviously getting alignment, having everyone really on the same page, or even putting together some sort of animation, putting together a note about it, talking about the challenges. Obviously, when you put it into a deck to kind of communicate it, and just making that as crisp as possible. And also being like really knowing your stuff in terms of subject knowledge. So don't isolate yourself from engineers and PMs and so on. Make sure like you're speaking the same language as them. You're with them all the time. They can come to you. They know they're not going to go, oh, we'll wait for design. Let's just align it over here with engineers and PM. Basically, be a bit of a PM, be a bit of an engineer. So you can do it whilst they're having those conversations. And I think that builds influence. And you can also get ahead of things as well, because you are a designer. You can almost put designs and ideas across early on, before all that other kind of heavy alignment needs to happen.
And I think to add to this, I like this idea of the visual stimulus. And if we, for example, think about a vision is nothing else than just like taking all these visual stimulus and putting them together. And that can happen way before it's shared. Like you don't build a vision in 2 weeks just out of nowhere. In a way, you have to have those two different tracks while you work. One is, how do you solve the current problems? And the other one is, how do you actually ensure that those problems fit into a larger piece of work that maybe points at what's going to happen in 5 years, right? And those may not be always shared across the team, but you need to be able to have yourself an opinion on what that is. So I always have, for example, like artboard or somewhere where I can actually collect all these thoughts and try to bring things together, because that means that you link up all these different initiatives that are done maybe in isolation into some bigger picture. And when you do the next one, you are using the same principles that you used for the previous work that you did with the team. And to add another point to all of this, there's timing. Timing is a very important part here too. That is a thing where you can try to oversell something way too early, and then you missed the ball there. You need to be able to understand when is the team and your peers ready to accept certain challenges. When are they trying to adopt a new narrative for the way they work? There's moments that it's just not going to happen. Like, it's going to be a very easy, very difficult sell. In the same way, if you're talking about vision, you cannot try to create a bridge that is just way too large. You're just not going to get people relate to what you're trying to tell them and what you're trying them to change.
So I think it's that time where I'm saying this, but if you're watching this podcast or listening to it, I'm saying this as if, well, this is only the second one, so how many times have you spoke about it? But there's been others that have been recorded, and this question I'm asking every time. And it's about AI, naturally. And I'm really interested every time. It's obviously a hot topic. And I know it's been spoken about. It's always spoken about. It's in LinkedIn posts. It's in other podcasts. And it's even just in broader society, not even just in design. But I'd love to I'm trying to get everyone's take on it who I've spoken to. And I don't want to kind of share. I mean, you might have seen one of the other ones. How do you see things going in terms of design with AI?
First of all, I think there's a lot to discover on what's the output of AI. Like, how do users interact with this technology?
Are you worried?
I think that right now we're in a moment where we try to replicate what we've seen everywhere. So we know a conversation sort of like it's successful when it comes to seeing that technology shine. And I don't have an answer to what I'm sort of going to propose, but I think there's a lot more that we could achieve, a lot more on how that AI and all of this technology makes decisions for us and how they assist us. And even I question sometimes how much of it needs to be user-facing. Is it about changing how we, and how, in that case, could be customers, could be professional users, interact with that technology? Do we need to see how that entity so delivers certain information to us? Or it's more about happening on the background, something that like we see automations happening and then we just act normally as humans without having to interact with an agent, like a sort of like digital agent or like some AI agent, basically. What's your take on this?
But are you worried though about your job?
About my job in general?
Yeah. It's an uncomfortable question, I know.
I'm slightly worried, but not enough to kind of freak me out yet. I know there's things happening on how, like AI can just build your design from scratch just by prompting them with something. And maybe that's going to change who we are as designers in the future. Maybe it's going to remove us, but then we're going to have to find what the next path for us is. And if that's what's going to happen to me, I'm just open as well to observe how that happens. I know that part of me is going to be willing to understand more about how to become, for example, like better at prompt engineering for those design tools. But I want to believe that process is going to be long, and maybe I'm not sure it's going to get to the point that it replaces us. I'm an optimistic. I'm also not a technocrat, so like I just believe technology is very powerful. But I think with time and as I grow older, maybe it's a weakness, but I just want to believe that technology won't solve all our problems. Like, people would always need to be behind in order to make the right decisions, because otherwise we just don't want things to be solved by themselves. We want to have something to do. We want to deal with complex problems. We enjoy those aspects of working, of living in general.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really interesting take. You asked what I thought, right? So I think it's been said before, AI won't replace designers. Only designers not using AI will be replaced, sort of thing. But I think there will be the role will evolve, and that people will merge. Almost PM design and so on will be an aggregated. You'll be doing a few things, and that already kind of happens. You have like design PM hybrids and so on. Don't so much have a PM who does the design. It's never that way around, but you do kind of have the design of being a bit of a PM. Correct me if I'm wrong, anyone, if you want, in the comments. But I think the way to look at it, am I worried? I think I am, because a little worried. I certainly think about it. I think it won't be, I think it will be quite a bit of time before it's at the point where it's like there's only very few design jobs. We still need quite a lot of designers and so on. But I think my advice would be to anyone is, and it's a way I've tried always being, is just make yourself very adaptable. Be always learning, offering value. Value doesn't have to be, if you're in a situation where it's like, can do this task. That's not in my that's not my wheelhouse, or I don't do that, so leave it. As soon as you start doing that, I think that's when you kind of like you almost deprecate your value. And so it's being adaptable, and like I don't know, I've had quite a few careers already, and they're very different ones. One was teaching. I've been a personal trainer, and design. I've been doing design for a long time now, but I think just maybe there's a bit of self-indulgent talking about my personal experiences, but if you're always trying to be the best or whatever is happening, and being proactive to learn about what's at the forefront of whatever you're working in, then you'll always be good, basically. And I think, having a culture of that's not mine, or that I was trained to do this, so I do that. I think that's quite dangerous, and I think you just need to always add incredible value. So as long as, I think as an individual, which I don't think is spoken about when you hear about things on LinkedIn and posts, it is always trying to kind of see the future of like the logistics of how it work. Like I gave an example, PMs and designers coming together. But I think step back from that and just be really employable. Make yourself super valuable. Always learning, eager, put energy into things. And so that is really the way to, I think, be safe and be good. And I think that will always stand anyone in good stead, anyone who's listening.
In a way, you kind of need to be always curious. You need to keep yourself curious. Don't try to be right. Don't try to have an answer to what you're trying to do. And instead just be like very aware that new things will always be happening that elevate quality to the next level. And if you're aware of those levels, to at least on what do they mean? What does it mean to work with them? That's going to make you like feel more comfortable as well, because that's not the point. There's a big psychological barrier. If you feel that you're scared because you don't understand something and you don't make the steps to understand it, you're in a position of losing that battle.
Yeah.
If you're in a position where you say, that's interesting, that's happening, I don't overreact to it, I'm not against it, then you're more open to understand it. Maybe you don't do anything right now, but you still have your eyes open to see what happens.
Yeah. And there is a bit of, I think competitiveness can always sound negative, can't it? Being competitive. Like if you say, that person is very competitive, it sounds quite negative. I think being quite competitive and it doesn't mean you have to be horrible, obviously very amicable, professional and so on, but it's very easy just to say, be a competitive person, but you do need a level of competitiveness in order to make sure you are pushing the boundaries of things. And I think that's really healthy. And I think anyone, like I said, who's listening, just obviously in a very nice, polite, courteous, professional way, always just be competitive, curious, like you said. I think that's stand you in good stead. And then I think the conversation about AI almost goes away. It's not to say that logistically there will be fewer jobs in certain areas and so on. That's going to happen no matter how competitive or how kind of curious you are. But what it does mean is that there will always be jobs, and there will be jobs in tech and space, and things will just evolve. And as long as you're doing that, I think you'll be in a good place.
I think sometimes we think about competitiveness as a negative thing because we word it as such. But at the end of the day, this just means that we're looking at other people and what they're able to do. And we're trying to learn from it. That's all we're trying to do, right? We're not trying to be better than somebody. We're just trying to understand how some people is able to do certain things and we are not. Whereas that we need to do better in order to do those things that we admire. Because we, end of the day, admire those people we try to imitate or like get learnings from.
I think hopefully that's a useful take. Very different take on some of the other conversations I've had about AI in some of the other conversations. So I think it's quite nice that anyone who is listening to different episodes, you'll get different takes. One thing I wanted to ask was about, Wise's mission is to make international money transfers seamless. And so if you could apply design to solve another global problem, what would that be?
So before I was in working at Wise, I worked for Babylon Health. Our mission there was to basically...
It's so funny. One of the other guests we had, that was one of the examples. Obviously, it was to do with health. Sorry, I'm interrupting. Yeah. So health. It's funny that people are going towards health, but yeah. Sorry, you do continue.
No, that's completely right, and I think the reason why is because we know it's something that is so essential to our human condition and just so valuable to try and make this more efficient. Like making money transfer more efficient is amazing, but almost healthcare goes to the next level. But the more value we actually attach to something, usually it comes with greater risks. So the risks of dealing with money are high, but the risk of dealing with healthcare are even higher. And that's something that Babylon we saw. You can sort of like try to make things better, but you need to be very careful on how you try to make those things better. It's also very complex sector in which a lot of different entities try to deliver healthcare in their own way. And that means that there's different ways or doctors may work in one company versus another versus public healthcare, and they use different tools. Those tools have different encryptions that are not compatible. All of this is a huge problem to solve through design and through engineering and data as well. I would love to come back at some point to this set of things when maybe AI has a lot of potential here too. And that's something that can be quite interesting to then jump in and try to finally solve in a better way.
Yeah. So healthcare seems to be, one of those. I feel like I'll keep asking this question and see what people say. Maybe we get an aggregate. If it's healthcare, then we can all join healthcare startups and businesses. Yeah, I was going to ask, is there a story or a piece of feedback that stands out to you as a reminder of your work matters?
So for me, there's an interesting take on what happens with professional users in this case.
Professional users?
Yeah, I mean like customer support agents.
Oh, okay.
Or like basically people that's paid to use or to perform tasks and use certain tools.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Yeah.
Like
pro users of any tool.
Exactly. And this has to do with trust. So realize there's a lot of like bug reporting. Like this happens like all the time, right? And then sometimes you read all these bug reports and you realize...
So bug reports,
yeah,
right?
Like bug reports, like any sort of complaint about something not working as expected. And something we saw while working in this customer support area was that agents were basically talking about something not working. But really what happened is that those things were fixed, but the perception of those things being fixed was not there. This, for me, touches on the importance of understanding our users, like to a level that it means that even if they're with us in a mission to accomplish something, they're still people and they still kind of put perception before facts. Hitting all this story and getting to see that the problem was on perception and trust was a huge thing for us because it meant that we actually had to go back and see how we apply our solutions, how we define those solutions, how do we sell those solutions, which from a change management perspective is also very important. And design has a lot to do here as well, because if we are not able to communicate to those internal users how things are changing and when they're changing, we remove predictability from the equation and things become way more complex to adopt and to get used to. So that's, I think that's a very important point that I saw coming from in that case, our pro users while working in the area.
I was going to ask, what advice would you give to any aspiring designers who would want to work at a company with mission-driven culture, such as Wise?
Yeah, maybe the advice would be a bit more generic than just willing to work on something that is mission-driven. A lot of people come to me asking what do they have to do to work for Wise. Reality is like each of us have their own journey, and it's important to be able to be passionate about what you're trying to achieve, like be mission-driven yourself, try to do things that are ethical, but also take the opportunities you can take to explore, to experiment, to try and see how do people work? What are the problems that you see in different types of companies? Build yourself a portfolio of how or what is the right environment for you to work in. Understand those bits before you can just jump into like a big play in the market. If you can jump straight away there, that's amazing. But just remember that it's a journey and you need to go through all those steps sometimes to get to the point you can see as a prize or as a final goal for you to be in.
So you're saying, like, really, someone's aspiring, like, I'm a designer, I'm fairly new. If I'm new, then it's basically you need to have some experience in other companies before you jump to it. Like, you need to have a bit of a portfolio of course you have to have a portfolio. But how about someone who is quite experienced and they want to go there? And like, for me, I'd think surely it's just having a really good portfolio, really good. Really, obviously, ideal if you've worked at places where they work on, complex problems. And so there's similarities there potentially with Wise, or maybe that's not necessary. Maybe they would rather have someone who's done something completely different. And then obviously when you're actually interviewing, coming across as a team player, presenting your work well, presenting it in a way that's engaging, aesthetically pleasing, like you can see that they got good craft. Is it not just as simple as that? Or like, what is the delta between, and the thing that differentiates it from maybe any other interviews or experiences to get into Wise?
So kudos to all the points you raised. I think those are like completely essential to getting to have or to join a company like Wise, or indeed any other company is mature enough to like look at those aspects.
Are they going to index on like craft, for example, or is it going to be something else? Like, just sorry, go on, you go.
So from my perspective, what I see is there's a big chunk of you being able to understand what the problem is, analyze the problem properly, and then link this to a solution. I see lots of portfolios that are like lacking in some of those aspects. Craft is very important, but in a way, what I would say is as a professional in design, craft needs to be something you do automatically. It shouldn't be what sells you the most. It just should be the surface of everything you try to do. So having strong narratives is another very important part. So being able to link problems to solutions and everything in between is something I would encourage people to seek to have. And depending on your experiences, this may be more difficult to find in some places than others. In the same way that some companies are better at tracking impact than other companies. But you still need to be able to have some proxy for what impact has your work produced. And I would say that that's an important part for anybody applying to a job in Wise or similar companies to make sure they have in place.
We're coming to the end, and I wanted to, I think I said this in one of the other podcasts, and I've totally stole this idea from other podcasts. I think lots of them are doing this now. Lots of podcasts are doing this. I'm just doing the same thing, copying that, very shamelessly. I was going to ask, if you were to come up with a question for the next guest, what would it be? And obviously, you don't know what sector they're coming from, what their level is. You don't know any of that. Just what would the question be? Something that would be really, might be something that, other podcasts might not have asked or heard, and someone who's, scrolling through YouTube, and they want to know something really insightful, what might that question be?
For me, if I was interviewing somebody, I would love to know what's that thing that produces the most headaches for people while working on a role and in a company. So I want to hear those things that actually are difficult and uncomfortable to talk about. Those things that are not necessarily like well-crafted stories, but that kind of make you feel where are the hard parts of product design, the really hard parts. That's something I would like to ask people about.
What is the hardest part? There you go. There you go. So what would it be? We're meant to be finishing, but go on. Why we're here?
To be fair, the part that I find more difficult, the part of aligning with people, understanding like how many people is involved in the problem, and getting to know how they think and see how can you actually help them. That tied then with how you actually help them build a strategy for how you want to approach something. I think the more long-term thing you think about things, the more complex it gets to actually have a real picture of how that's going to happen. And that's something like sometimes it just produces me a lot of headaches trying to see, is that the right thing? You have to take these big bets on how you want to proceed.
There's kind of a bit of alignment and understanding and getting buy-in and making sure everyone understands it. And so it's that.
But the part of making the bet as well. You need to make some bets on where do you want to go. It's very easy to make bets in the short term. Like you just do something, the feedback loops are way faster. You just get some answers from whether you think is right or not.
Yeah.
But when it comes to thinking about how do you want to platformize the whole platform, there's so many decisions that are there that getting those bets right and you feeling comfortable with failure as well scares me sometimes. So,
well, thank you, Oriol. Yeah, super insightful. I think fintech seems to be, it's got lots of nuance and lots of complexity. It seems that Wise is a really great place to, obviously, there might be some biasness on your side, but you seem like you're being as open as you could possibly be. And it seems like for anyone who would maybe considering like going to Wise or so, if it's a great environment, if you want to develop your craft and develop as a designer, it's a great place to be. And they've got a strong design culture. You know, obviously that's just a word that's thrown around a lot, design culture and so on, but it sounds like it's a genuine one that is respected and there's growth opportunities there. So thank you again. And I'm looking forward to seeing when you're a principal designer, maybe.
Maybe.
Thank you.
Pleasure.